So welcome everyone. So about 2 o'clock, so we have a pretty full session, so I might go ahead and get started. I'm here today to talk about 2FA implementation best practices. Before we start, I'm going to do something that no one's ever done before and ask you guys to text this number. I'm sure you've never seen this at Signal before. So we're actually going to come back around. You might get a text back from a different number, but primarily this is just something I'm going to do, and we're going to come back to it at the end of the talk. If you are texting from a non-+1 number, you're not going to get anything back because GDPR scares the hell out of me. So it's just +1s. Thank you. All right. Cool. So to start off, introduce myself, Josh Staples. I'm a sales engineer at the account security group at Twilio. I'm also renowned for having about 12 different accounts on Have I Been Pwned that have been compromised. I'm also a former government contractor, so that means I was subjected to the Office of Personnel Management hack, which means all of my PII for about 10 years is floating around the dark web along with my fingerprints. So I'm not just a security wonk, but I'm a pretty security conscious consumer. I'll be joined later by my colleague Lucas Vidal, who's an engineering manager for Authy down in Bogota, Colombia. So general agenda, I'm going to talk about being pragmatic when you're looking and considering your second factor implementation. We're going to talk about actually planning an implementation, actually doing an implementation, and Lucas is going to show it. And then we're going to talk about something called proactive sleuthing. So what you do after the implementation to sort of provide a best value for what you've actually done. Account security. This is a great picture by a company in France called Blue Coders. They're very liberal with letting people use it. So what do you think of when you think about account security and you see this, right? It's what users see and what providers see. So you go to a website, you log in, username and password, second factor maybe. It's just rosy and everything, you know, sunshine and butterflies, rainbows, just great stuff. Well, when you're actually doing this kind of implementation, you get a different perspective. There's a lot of nastiness out there that you're going to have to deal with as a provider. And I think this picture does a great job of depicting that kind of that issue. So this is the only slide that will actually have a chart. And so I'm going to ask you guys to think a little bit. Well, essentially we're comparing identity assurance versus cost and user burden. So what do I mean by identity assurance? So if someone authenticates with a second factor, this is how sure you are that person is actually the identity authenticating. And the cost and user burden being the actual financial cost or just the effort it requires me to have a second factor and to provide that second factor. Specifically around, you know, it could be carrying a dongle around, a YubiKey, having my phone available. It's that kind of user burden. So I sort of categorize this into 3 different sections. We have mid, low, and high identity assurance. We're going to talk about the different feature sets that you can have with 2FA. So obviously the best solution right now is YubiKeys, UTF. These are great solutions, but they only work for certain circumstances. Google's been very vocal about them, like they've essentially eliminated hacks and attacks in their internal environment, but you know, they can dictate that. As part of a condition of working for Google, you have to use a YubiKey, right? So you're not going to be able to do that if you have a recipe website where grandma has her favorite chili site, right? You're not going to be able to do that. It just doesn't work. One great solution that we do offer is push notification. The user burden is relatively low. I don't have to carry around a YubiKey like I do with the UTF solutions. But the push notifications are really, really great for a few reasons. One, it's not over SMS, it's not over telephony, it's typically over a data wire. And there's great stuff you can do with an application on your phone. You can sign the actual payload when someone approves it. You can encrypt the connection between the actual application and the back end. And it's also effortless. I click a single approve, deny, and it just works. It's really straightforward. We also have, of course, TOTP, time-based one-time password, one-time code. This is very similar to Google Authenticator. Essentially, a seed's initiated when you start the app, and then it generates a code every 20 seconds. It's a great solution, but again, you have to have your phone with you. You have to carry it around. It is also a solution that works in offline mode. So if you're in an airplane, you're underground, where you don't have carrier access, it's a great solution providing that second factor. Voice is also a solution before, but as someone noted in the last presentation, like if I'm calling an IVR center, how am I going to authenticate with voice since I'm already on the phone? So it's a bit of a burden. It's also very expensive, especially when we're talking about international calling. Toll for all is also a vector here for voice, so it is something you have to be wary of. There is a higher cost and a higher user burden for actually using voice communication. And of course, SMS. This is obviously the elephant in the room, the SS7 protocol. SMS is great because it's a global solution, global delivery. If you have a really large user base, very distributed, it might be the only solution that you can actually use for a second factor. And of course, since I mentioned SMS, we have to mention the other omni-channel opportunities that Twilio has. So Twilio, for example, we're just engaged with WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, Line. These are all other solutions that you can actually provide a second factor over. The great thing about them is, of course, they're not subjected to the SS7 protocol hack that you'll see with SMS. And of course, as everyone knows, my favorite food is pizza. These KBA questions, they just don't work. It's no bueno anymore. And of course, there are hacks every single week, with password hacks, data leaks. You know, that's what Have I Been Pwned is for. It's just very low identity assurance. And of course, when you're looking at this chart, you want to figure out where exactly is your site. What sort of authentication mechanisms do you need to actually provide identity assurance for your product? And we'll get into this discussion in a little bit. So the reason I really wanted to show you this chart is because when you actually approach your 2FA implementation, you need to be pragmatic, right? There's only one way you can guarantee 100% 2FA adoption, and I'll talk about that later. But really, when you're looking at your solution, when you're trying to encourage user adoption, you don't want to make it so difficult that no one enables 2FA, but you do want to be pragmatic enough to say, hey, we need to provide a solution that hits the majority of our users. So when you're considering this, some questions you can think is, what exactly are you protecting? Are you protecting a recipe website? Are you protecting your local soccer club sign-up sheet? Are you protecting money? Is it a Bitcoin index? This is a question you really have to ask yourself at the very beginning. It's like, what am I protecting? Is it worth the account takeover for a website to provide a very expensive solution, something like YubiKey? If it's just a soccer club website, you really don't need these more expensive solutions because the identity assurance sort of y-axis isn't really that important. You also want to think about your demographics. If it is, say, AARP's website, your grandmother, my parents, they're not going to be pulling down the AARP website to set up a push notification for second factor. You have to think about how your actual demographic distribution is. If it's leaning older, they might be more comfortable with SMS. If it's leaning younger, they might be totally okay with push notifications. So you want to think about that as well. Additionally, your global distribution. Where are your actual users? Are they primarily in the US? Do you have any plans to take your company beyond the US? If so, you want to think about local laws and regulations that you have to deal with. For example, one company I worked with recently wasn't paying attention. They had built out their own solution, and when Canada decided to say no more application to person, text over long code as of this date, well, this company provides a second factor solution, and all of a sudden, on one day, all communication to Canada quit over their solution. So they approached us and we're like, yeah, there's laws and regulations all around the world that you really have to figure out how to deal with, and you have to pay attention. So it's something you really want to consider when you're looking at your worldwide distribution. Also, the user type. If I'm on Twitch, a website, those are a lot of very smart, very young people. Maybe push notification is the appropriate default solution for a second factor. If they aren't very savvy users, it's probably going to be SMS. So you want to think about that as well. Additionally, languages. How many countries are you actually going to distribute second factors to? Are you going to have voice actors actually doing the voice OTP? Are you going to have actual appropriate and literal translations for your SMSs? How many languages are you going to support? So account security specifically, we use our data to drive those decisions, and right now we support about 35 different languages in both voice and SMS. So automatic translations, and these translations have been communicated to carriers around the world to make sure that that actual message gets through. Additionally, you want to think about what kind of device support. We have some customers who have clean rooms. These are rooms where you can't have a phone. It could be a banking call center. It could be something security related or sort of top secret clearance kind of issue. They might only have the opportunity to have a computer in there. If that's the case, then you need to provide some kind of second factor solution on a computer. Additionally, they might not have a cell phone at all. It might just be a mobile device or a landline. In that case, you have to provide an OTP over voice. So you want to think about what kind of device support you have. Additionally, how many users? If it's 10 people in an IT department, YubiKey is a very easy solution to implement. If you're talking about 100 people, maybe 1,000 people, 1,000,000 people, what are you going to do? Unless you're actually selling YubiKeys, you're never going to use a YubiKey for a second factor, right? That kind of scope. So in this kind of situation, maybe SMS is the best solution because of the size of your user base you have to deal with. Additionally, you want to think about support. No, there's going to be some situation will arise where someone's locked themselves out. They're going to call your help desk and say, hey, my name's Josh. Please unlock my 2FA. The problem with this is, one, you're going to get an influx of calls, especially if you have a large user base. So you're going to have to train up your support team, your help desk team, maybe hire more people. The other problem here that's real obvious is how do you vet someone's identity, right? How do you actually know is Josh calling in? So it's a huge problem that you're going to have to figure out. And lastly, of course, how much effort do you want to be? Implementing 2FA for many companies is not what they do day in and day out. It's just a security addition that they're adding to support their users, to reduce account takeovers, and to really just reinsure their brand reputation around the world. So the company I mentioned earlier that missed the Canadian effort, they had 3 full-time employees sort of tasked with monitoring that situation. Once they came and talked to us, they were able to take 3 full-time employees. We're talking engineers on the West Coast are $1 million a year. They were able to take those 3 FTEs and move them off to a different department entirely to focus on other tasks. So when you're thinking about your approach, you really want to consider, is it more worthwhile to buy a solution, or is it appropriate to build and then manage a solution? So there's actually probably a lot more points I can talk about here, but generally when planning your implementation, there are a few things you have to figure out. One, how do you onboard new users? Generally, when you're onboarding new users, most websites, you log in, username, password, then there's a settings page where you have to kind of drill down into the settings, enable 2FA, verify your phone number, and it really takes an effort. It's something people have to actually go through and want to do. I worked with a SaaS company a few months ago. They changed their onboarding workflow for new users, and right after you create your username and password, it prompts you for a phone number. It's optional, but it's right there, part of the new user onboarding flow. Their adoption went from 2% to 40% overnight, right? That's a 20x increase in second factor adoption. Their security team was ecstatic. They were so happy. This was like amazing, a simple change, part of the onboarding flow, and we get this result. Their accounting department was absolutely mad because it totally blew out their projections for the year. Additionally, you want to think about when you're actually looking at implementations to reach out with the users. If you have a very popular service, something like Twitch, for example, you have celebrities on this site. These are people who absolutely want to protect their identity. You also want to demonstrate value by communicating with your customers to say, hey, we're doing this for you. It sort of allows customers to realize that, hey, whatever your company is really looking out for us, and they're trying to provide us with an appropriate second factor solution. And the big secret for 2FA adoption is whatever product you have, if you want to get to 100%, all you have to do is create a cryptocurrency, somehow associate it with your product, and then have an initial coin offering, an ICO. So it's interesting in the Bitcoin, because it is kind of the Wild West these days. Coinbase, Binance, Gemini, these really large companies, most of them have near 100% 2FA adoption. It is the only situation, the only use case, the only business product that actually results in near 100% 2FA adoption. Cool, so next I'm going to show you a couple best practice workflows. So we have 3 APIs with account security, one called Lookup, one called Verify, and one called Authy. You can think of Lookup as a data tool. Verify is a one-time verification where you actually verify the phone is in someone's hand. Think about it when you're signing up for Uber, you get an OTP, type in that code, they know it's your phone number. And Authy, you can think about it as a sort of repeated use second factor. So it's not the phone verification, but it's repeated use using a different TOTP, push notifications, voice or SMS for delivery. So don't bother taking a picture. There's actually going to be a link or a text at the end of this presentation where you can actually get a copy of all these assets. But this is our verify best practice. So it starts off with just prompting the user for a phone number, and then you actually do phone number analytics. So the very first thing you would want to do is figure out what kind of phone number this is. Is it a landline? Is it a VoIP? Is it a non-fixed VoIP like Google Voice? Is it a fixed VoIP like Vonage, for example? Is it a mobile? So is it actually a legitimate phone number? Is it properly formatted? That's the very first thing you want to do. Subsequently, you can work through this workflow and sort of go through a process where you're attempting an SMS, you allow someone to try 3 times for an SMS, and then you go down to a voice, and then subsequently to some kind of support. The workflow is very similar for Authy as well, but of course we offer more options, the push and TOTP. And again, these kind of charts sort of show the actual API calls that happen and also talk about the number of attempts you want to allow someone to try. Cool, so the actual implementation of that workflow, the very first thing you want to do is phone number analytics, and you can use our lookup tool for this. A lookup tool provides a lot of information. We're talking the actual line type, we're talking ported date. Typically a fraud indicator is a phone number that was recently ported. If you see that, it might be a cause for concern. What you can also do is pull down a lot of information about the user. So remember that phone number you guys texted earlier? Yes, okay, we'll come back to that. You can pull down a lot of information. It's kind of the modern day reverse phone book. Back in the 90s, 80s, you would have yellow pages. Well, the police and sort of government officials actually had a reverse phone book as well, where you could take a phone number and get someone's address from it. So there's a lot of information you can get from Lookup. One thing you want to consider too is rate limiting. So another anecdote, so there are a couple kinds of rate limiting. It says back-end rate limiting, saying how many times someone can actually make a request. Then there's front-end rate limiting. So when I showed earlier the workflow of how many SMSs you can request, one problem you might have are impatient users. So someone clicks an SMS, they don't get an SMS within 2 seconds, so they click it again, click it again, click it again, click it again. All of a sudden they're locked out because they've tried too many times. So that kind of UIUX rate limiting is where you actually prevent someone from requesting another SMS for 20 seconds, 40 seconds, 60 seconds. It's like it's an exponential fall off almost. The back-end rate limiting is a little bit different. So this is actually rate limiting to actually limit how many requests someone can make in a day. And an anecdote for you. We have another SaaS company who built out their own 2FA solution with programmable SMS. There was a credential leak on another service on the web. And over the weekend, because they hadn't built in rate limiting, hackers had tried to essentially use credential stuffing, which is where you stuff a bunch of credentials into scripts to break into this SaaS service. The SaaS employees came in Monday morning, and there was about a $20,000 SMS bill from the weekend. They had built no rate limiting, so as fast as the code could execute, people were trying to use these leaked credentials to get into the service. So after talking to us, they're like, yeah, rate limiting is a pretty good idea, right? So generally there are a couple types. There's per application rate limiting, but there's also per user. So per user rate limiting would be you can only make 10 SMS requests a day, right? After 10, you might be sort of suspended for an hour or so, but it's something you're gonna have to consider when you're actually implementing your own solution. Also the UI/UX. So as part of your implementation, you're going to be working with your designer to actually design a UI/UX that's appropriate for those questions we asked earlier. Like, what does your user base look like? If it's young and savvy techie types, maybe you want to default to SMS or default to push notification first. If it skews older generation, you might want to default to SMS as well. But at least provide the options for people to up-level their security if they so want. Also want to talk about reauth. So reauth is how frequently do you actually ask someone to authenticate. If I'm a bank, it might be every day. If I'm an IVR center, it might be every time there's a protected action. Protection action being, say, an account change an address, something like that. If I'm an IT employee, maybe every day. And a lot of attacks in IT actually happen over the weekend, so having someone re-authenticate on a Saturday and Sunday, not just Monday through Friday, is really useful in preventing some attacks. And of course, if you're just a general viewer like myself on Twitch, every 30 days is fine. Obviously, when you do auth, and this is a conversation I have quite frequently, what is an appropriate time frame? If I'm just a viewer and there's really no sort of loss associated with the account takeover, then why not go ahead and set a cookie for 30 days and they never have to re-authenticate for that month? Of course, they will have to re-authenticate if they go to a new device. So the point is that you really have to figure out what is the appropriate re-auth timeout for your solution. So now I'm going to actually ask Lucas to come up here on stage, and he's going to walk you guys through a sample implementation.
Test.
Okay.
Yes.
Too many muscles.
Can you hear me? Yes. Great. So I'm about to show you how easy it is to implement the 2FA solution on your website. I'm actually not going to deep dive on what the API calls must be. I'm using this one. Testing. Oh, much better. I can hear myself. I'm not going to deep dive on the actual API calls to the auth because you can find them in the Twilio docs very easily. Instead, I'm going to focus on what you need to consider when you are implementing this in your own websites. For this demo, I have. If you've been there for the previous talk, you will see that we use the old bank site, which acts like a bank website. And for this demo, I have these credentials that I need to use. So the only security that is behind this is my user and password. So let's say you get together with the product team and you decide that this is a resource that you want to protect. You need to reach to the engineering team, and they will tell you that it's very complicated, but actually you will need to change a couple of rules in the routing controller there, assuming this is your router, on which you will decide that everything that is behind this path that is protected will be requiring an authentication session on 2 factors. So as you can see, the implementation is right above. I'll just check in for this variable to be true, and also that the authentication has been made. If one of those fails, then I will redirect to the user to the corresponding credential requirement. So once again, see, now I'm in the 2FA section. This is the page where you will want to challenge the user to see if they have actually the possession of the device that you already registered. So this is where you take the second decision with your product team. What is the type of authentication that you want to ask for your users? Do you decide to use SMS, voice, or you want to use a push authentication or verify a TOTP that the app generates? For this demo, I'm going to show you the push. So it got right to my device. I can see the context information of this push, and I can approve it. And there, I'm in. So sensitive information right now is protected by a second factor authentication. The key takeaway here is you need to think very well, what are the resources that you want to protect and what aren't the resources? You don't want to add extra verifications on places where you don't want to add more friction, and only use it for those specific places. And the other thing that you need to decide is what is the type of the authentication that you want to offer. If nothing else, I'll leave you with Josh.
All right, thank you, Lucas. So the intent here is, and this is a question I'm asked quite frequently when I'm actually interacting with customers, is how long is this going to take? You know, with the Authy solution, and I love this question, I get to respond, well, if your engineer is worth his salt, a couple hours, right? Can you imagine? Like, he did it in a few minutes with pre-staged code, but you can literally have a global 2FA solution in a couple hours. It's pretty amazing for a managed solution. So that brings us to post-implementation, what I call proactive sleuthing. So we have a few APIs available under account security, one called a webhooks. Webhooks gives you real-time information about events that are actually happening. So say, for example, you subscribe to a webhook of phone verification failed, and you get 10 of those in a row from a particular user. This is real-time notifications. That's something you can use as security escalation. You say, something's really wrong with this user. Let's suspend the account, try and reach out via email and see what's going on. We also have a reporting API. The reporting API gives you a top-down perspective. If you want to build out charts for the last 3 months of your traffic, reporting API is how you do it. Both of these data sets, both of these APIs give you great data sets. And as Simon mentioned earlier with SIF Science, we have several large companies who are actually taking this data, aggregating it with the rest of their data from their platform, and running machine learning at it. It provides a great way to find bad actors and bad patterns, just some way to be suspicious about the actual problem you're having. And it's common. It's happening day in and day out. Additionally, rate limits. Again, if you're seeing people hammering your rate limits, there's probably something fraudulent going on. So I was working with a mobile app company just last week, and they have a substantial amount of abuse. And part of the problems with abuse, especially when you're trying to log in and password, is it reduces your conversion rate. So when we look at a second factor solution, we look at the conversion rate. What is the conversion rate of someone successfully authenticating inside the US? You know, a typical conversion rate is 94, 98%. It's way up there. It's super great. Well, their conversion rate's down to about 90 because of the amount of fraud on their platform. So I started thinking, like, well, what exactly can I do to help them out? And I looked through, we run a product called Kibana that gives you some great aggregation into massive amounts of data. And I looked for unique phone number hashes that were occurring within a certain time frame. Within a single day, I found about 500 different phone numbers that were just abusing the heck out of the system. We're talking 2,000 login attempts within a single day, right? It was like, why weren't they aware of this? I don't know. We turned it around though. We were able to provide this information to them, and they implemented rate limiting into their own login process to reduce this problem. Additionally, with the data aggregation, machine learning, everything else you're going to have, you want to think about escalation, right? So when you do actually see a problem, when you have a bank where you're not too sure about their identity, you have to have a process in place for this escalation. Say, all right, we don't actually know who you are, Josh, so maybe we'll have a video chat and you can show me your government ID, right? It's a very common solution for vetting identities of people you aren't too aware about. And of course, your entity, your phone number. This is where you can take someone's phone number, do some lookups against it, and actually find out a lot of information. And let me underscore, a lot of information. Many of you don't realize the amount of public information that is attached to your phone number. If you go to for example, if you go to a mall and there's a free drawing for a car right there, you fill out that sweepstakes data, what do you think's going on with that data, right? They're selling it to data aggregators. And data aggregators are attaching it to databases, and they're turning around and trying to sell that data to companies like Facebook. That being said, if you are using a phone number for a 2FA, don't do what Facebook did, right? Do not turn around, take that data, and leverage it to sell ads to your customers. That's just not cool in any sense. Cool, so now that we've gone through the presentation here, I'm gonna drop out here. And this is what I got back from a lookup call against my own personal phone number. So if you notice, it has a lot of information. It has my name, my age, my sex, my alternate name, Josh, when I actually started with the phone number that I'm actually currently using. It also gives me associated people, my wife, my father, my roommates, former old roommates. It also gives you current address. I live in Oakland, as you guys can see, and former addresses. This is all information that's very easy to reach out and grab. We have some customers who, as part of their onboarding process, they use our Lookup API to verify information. So say, for example, you're I'll just pick on Sears because they're not doing well anyway. Say you're checking out a Sears credit card, you fill out a bunch of information, and then you put a phone number there as well. Well, at the store kiosk, you might not have time to do a full background check, do a credit check against these people. But what you can do is pull information off of Lookup and verify if the information that with the phone number they provided correlates to the information on their application. So it's sort of a soft verification check. So those of you who actually texted that number earlier in the session, this is what that's for. So you can actually see, it's not too many people, but I actually killed most of your PII because I don't want to be that guy. Kind of a jerk thing to do. But I did leave myself up there just as an example. You can see all the different numbers here. I only limited it to 25 right now, so we're actually going to see if we can pull more people. This is your first name, last four of your phone number. And again, this is just completely accessible. We'll try 50, see what happens. I think we maxed out the room. But yeah, it's an incredibly powerful product, and it's lots of ways you can proactively look at your user base and figure out what's going on. So back to the presentation. Cool, so takeaways. I love the British version of a takeaway. It's food to go, right? So takeaways, plan pragmatically. Think about those questions, those points I brought up earlier. Pick the right technology for your use case. SMS might not be the solution for money transfers. Push or YubiKey, yes, certainly. Know your user base. Use the Lookup API. Use the data they provide to sort of get to know your user base and know their use cases. And plan for support. Know that there's going to be some long tail situation that you haven't accounted for, that you're going to have some kind of support process in place to essentially help out your user. And of course, proactively monitor. Machine learning, reporting API, webhooks API, these are all things you can do, the Lookup API, to actually pull down data about your users. So I guess we'll jump to Q&A. There is a phone number on the bottom there. If you want to see these flows or some of these talking points, links, or anything else, you can actually text that phone number, and it'll respond in a few seconds, 20 seconds maybe, with a bit.ly link to a bunch of hard assets from this presentation that might help you guys with your own implementation. But let's go ahead and start with questions. Sir, up here.
Actually, 2 questions. The first is, what roles do you see like in the future of biometrics taking place here, like facial recognition, voice recognition, iris recognition? And then the other part is, how do organizations account when somebody changes their phone number? Because as an end user, I've had problems with that. When my phone number have changed, I've had trouble getting into the whole system.
Right, great question. So we'll tackle biometrics first. Biometrics are okay, right? My thumbprint, which is floating around on the web, unfortunately, is only as good as about a 4-digit PIN, right? So think about that. If you're asking for a thumbprint, you might want to not use a thumbprint for money transfer. You might want to integrate that biometric into your actual application. But it's not great. It's especially thumbprints. Facial biometrics, what we see with the iPhone X, is completely different. It's a whole new ballgame. Historically, facial biometrics wasn't very good because it didn't account for tan or darker skinned people. It worked for lighter skinned people like myself, but when you actually get to global distribution, knowing your user type, knowing your base, there are a lot of problems with biometrics. The second question was phone changes. So that's actually a great feature set we've built into the Authy application. When you're actually using Authy for repeated use 2FA, we disassociate the actual 2FA process from the phone number. And the first step with the Authy registration is you get an Authy ID back. So that's this ID you see right here. If I have to go and change my phone number, say I move to a new country or anywhere else, I can go into any Authy application, change that right here, and it will essentially reassociate my previous phone number with the new phone number, or with the Authy ID. So we essentially, in the back end, Authy abstracts away the phone number from actual 2FA communication for exactly this reason. So for example, if I were to have a new phone, I would actually have to go into every single one of these websites without this solution to actually go and change my 2FA. And to do that, you're going to need your old phone number to actually provide that second factor to go in and change it anyway. So the Authy solution right now is probably the most robust. That being said, there are still a couple issues with some, again, long tail users, people who've lost their phone or like, and we actually have a phone change and phone reset process that our security team operates 24/7, and there's about a 48-hour delay between when someone loses their phone and like, we have to do this, and there's a whole vetting process. So we ask for a government ID. If we're really suspicious, we'll actually do a video chat with them to make sure this happens. So these solutions are what we offer to our customers. It's sort of a value add because we take support calls away from you guys, and we really manage the risk quite well. And we also have a lot of insight into what's going on because our user base is so small. We've seen just about every fraudulent pattern that can exist. Any more questions? No more questions?
In the back.
In the back?
Just following up on that last point, I recently found out that gotcha because I used Google Authenticator and we use it in our company, and I was going to do a factory reset of my phone, and it's a good thing I double checked because I would have lost access to a number of AWS accounts and other accounts that I use Google Authenticator for. we switch completely to Authy since it allows that backup mechanism.
Yes, the backup feature is great. So with Google Authenticator, it's a single phone, right? That seed's going to be on that single phone. They provide you backup codes, but I've yet to meet someone who actually saves backup codes. If you do, come and shake my hand afterwards, because I'd like to talk to you a little bit. What's great about Authy, though, is we do provide that backup. We also provide multi-device support. So it's not really clear in this, but you can have as many devices as you want. So I put my wife's phone on my Authy account, I put my iPad on my Authy account. So if you don't have your phone, there are plenty of ways to actually have a way to have a second factor. If I do have to replace this phone, you know, since it's backed up to other devices, there's really no stop gap right there you have to think about. Yeah, it's a wonderful solution. I will say too, if you lose a phone, say one of these devices in my circle of trust, you can remove it from the Authy application. So say I did lose an iPad, that iPad's going to have its own unique seed generating its own codes for TOTP. I can remove that from my circle of trust with a single press inside the Authy application. So we kind of, I like to think we've covered most of the basis for fraudulent activity. Any other questions? Cool. So just to give you an example, these are some of the companies we support right now. Huge user base that is Authy. Again, think about if you're going to build it, you're going to buy it, reach out to us. josh@twilio.com is my email. Feel free to shoot me questions. I can engage with you guys, put you in touch with the sales account exec. But yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you.